balanced. The designer needs to spend the money in the right places. You should recognize what's important and also what's not. Now, this is a challenge because it's about good judgment. There isn't a universal answer. And it's important to develop a thorough understanding not only of the intended customer, but also of your own workforce, of the people who will build the product and the tools they will use, because it's essential to do what you're good at. The product should have just the right features. And when I say this, I mean it should have exactly the right features and only the right features. Versatility is a great thing, but only when it's what I call a coherent versatility. This means that all the possible uses for the product pull the design in the same direction. So you're not facing the situation where you're diluting the money you have to spend on the individual parts, because this quickly weakens the design and reduces the product lifetime. One of the most astute observers when it comes to versatility was Gustav Pazarek. He was actually an art historian, but had a strong interest in product design. And in the early 20th century, he gathered many examples together into a book and categorized them in groupings like aberrations of taste and collisions of purpose. And one of his favorite examples was the so-called stool tisch. Literally, in translation, the chair table. It was a chair that you could convert into a table. And it was a bad chair and a bad table. And the designer seemed to miss the point that most people want both at the same time. You should then work to strengthen and streamline your design and manufacturing. So once you build a prototype, you can invite people to try and break it. You can find out where the weak points are. You can add some material. You can change the geometry to reinforce those points. And maybe there are other points that are too strong, that have too much material. They're heavy. You can take some of this material, thin the point, borrow it, and use it elsewhere. And you should be counting the parts that you're using, because the more parts you have in a design, the more expensive it will be. And sometimes you need a few more for the sake of modularity and repairability, but not always. So it's important to count and compare that number to your competitors' products. You should also be thinking about the manufacturing processes you're going to use, because for a small production run, something like 3D printing is a good choice. But for a large production run, die casting, for example, would be more economical. And you should be working to ensure that the parts have similar lifetimes. You don't have to worry that everything's going to break on the same day. That doesn't happen. Randomness is your friend here. You should pay careful attention to detail. If you think of a car, a good car and a bad car essentially have the same parts. The differences come down to the quality of the thinking and the design calculations and the precision of the manufacturing and the consistency of the materials and even things like the colors and textures. And these are often things that the owner can feel very strongly but can't measure. And you should be looking for small design changes that make the product better without costing you extra money. If you're making hand tools, something like adding a flat to the handle of a screwdriver so that it can't roll off the bench. Or with a coffee maker, a lip underneath the hot plate so that if the coffee gets spilt, it doesn't land in the electrical workings below. And you should be looking to eliminate features that cost a lot of money but don't mean anything to the owner. A lot of early microwave ovens had a temperature probe that you could stick in a chicken and plug into the roof of the microwave. And no one used them because people don't cook chickens in microwaves. It doesn't taste good. I also saw a toaster recently that had an inbuilt smoke detector. Now, if someone's worried about the risk of fire, they probably already have a smoke detector. And if they're not worried about that risk, the feature's not going to mean anything in the toaster. It's important to remember that a great idea doesn't automatically translate into a great product. You also need a great implementation. Lastly, you should be seeking the best viable compromise. Obviously, if you spend money on one part, you can't spend it elsewhere. But you should be looking to maximize the plus points for the owner and minimize the minus points. Good example here is Harry Ferguson's classic grey TE20 tractor from the mid-20th century. It was the first tractor to use his novel 3-point linkage, which made ploughing safer and enabled the tractor to use a wider variety of agricultural implements. And it also had very few weak points. It had a coherent versatility. And for this reason, it's sought after today, both by smallholders who want to use it and also by collectors. Now, values and attitudes vary a lot with time and place. And this is why I've picked an example from far away, from the Soviet Union. Now, at one time, the Soviet Union was the biggest country in the world, and it had a lot of variety when it came to climates and communities, and some stunning inventions that went along with this. You could get an oil lamp that had a thermoelectric generator in the top, so you could hang it up in your living room, fill it with paraffin, light the lamp, illuminate the room, and then run a pair of wires down to a radio. And you could listen to a radio even if you didn't have mains electricity or a supply of batteries. And then there was the concept of prakat. Prakat was essentially product rental. So you could go to a prakat store, and it was like a department store with a wide range of domestic appliances, but they were all for rental rather than for sale. So maybe it snowed and you wanted to take your children out to enjoy the snow. You could rent a sledge for the weekend. Or maybe you were working for a few months in a city far away from home. You could rent a television for that period. And when it came back to the prakat store at the end of the rental, it would go out to someone else. It wouldn't be wasted and it wouldn't sit cluttering up your cupboard. And today in Russia, I love the spontaneity, the way that people want to try things out immediately without making a lot of plans. They want to see if they can fix something or design something or build something in a new way. And when I was working there, some of my students needed a pair of laser cut gears to finish a prototype, and they wanted them in a hurry. They wanted them the same day, and it was already about 1 p.m. So the student makes a few phone calls, and he finds a company in St. Petersburg that can make the gears, but the price was way too much. And he says to the guy, "No, sorry, can't afford it." Puts down the phone. About 10 minutes later, his phone rings. It's the company. They're halving the price. Is that any good? Student thinks about it. Nah, still too much money, sorry. Puts down the phone. Another 10 minutes go by. Phone rings again. It's the company. Now they can do it for a quarter of the price. How's that? Student thinks for a moment. He says, "All right, it's a deal." Guy on the other end of the phone says, "Right, I'll cut the gears. I'll see you in 90 minutes on the platform of the metro station. I'll bring the parts, you bring cash." Many of the appliances in the Soviet Union were inspired by the space age, particularly vacuum cleaners. There was the rocket, the Saturn, the Sputnik. And this, which I've chosen as my example for balanced, one of the most famous, the Vortex. The first thing you notice about this vacuum cleaner is the evocative shape. To me, it's like a satellite or a space probe, but it makes other people think of the helmet of a Roman legionary. Either way, it's not something you're going to forget easily. You'll also notice that it has two holes where you can attach the hose. If you attach it down at the bottom here, it sucks like an ordinary vacuum cleaner. But if you attach it at the top, it blows and you can operate a spray gun. I'll come back to that later. It's an all-metal design. The bulbous parts are pressed out of mild steel sheet, about 1 millimeter thick, and the switch housing and handle are an aluminium die casting. Makes for quite a heavy vacuum cleaner. This is about 8 kilograms, and it's finished in hammer tone paint. There were some in this series that were alternatively finished in mother of pearl paint for a sparkling, slightly iridescent look. If we turn it around, you can see the data plate. Here it has the Russian name, Vihry, meaning vortex, and it says that it was built at the Electromet plant in St. Petersburg in 1967. This vacuum cleaner would originally have cost 47 rubles 50. That's about half the monthly wage of a factory worker at the time, or perhaps 1/10 the wage of a professor or military officer. So it was expensive, but not exorbitant. And there are vacuum cleaners around today that cost a similar amount, and they won't be anything like as durable. If we open the toggle clamps here and look inside the base, you can see that the filtering is done using sheets of fabric. Here is a piece of coarse calico stretched across a steel frame, and on the other side there's a cotton bag with a drawstring. This is a great design because if anything happens to the filters, if you can't buy them in the shops anymore, you can patch them up or make your own, and you're no longer dependent on the supply chain. I've now taken out the bolts which hold the case together so that we can take a look inside. These all come out easily using an ordinary spanner and a flat screwdriver. There are no special tools required. So here we can see the motor. It's a universal motor which drives a 3-stage centrifugal turbine below. And it's very easy to swap the brushes, which are a common wear point on vacuum cleaners. You just undo the cap here with your fingers and pull the brush out. And when this was new, it came with spare brushes included in the box. It's also very quiet because the motor end bell here has 4 spokes for stiffness. And the motor's also mounted on a heavy rubber pad. So it's much more pleasant to use than many later vacuum cleaners. Nevertheless, I would have 2 minor criticisms. The first is that over the years, the grease in the ball bearings can dry out and make them stiff. And then the motor runs slower and it doesn't suck so well. And it's very difficult to wash out the old grease and replenish this with new grease because you have to take the whole motor and turbine apart to get to the bearings. And maybe that didn't matter so much in the Soviet Union because they had domestic appliance repair centers, and there was a list of the local centers provided in the box with the new vacuum cleaner. The other thing I'd criticize is this handle. It looks wonderful, this cantilevered arch shape, but geometrically it's not very strong, and they do occasionally break. Now, maybe that didn't matter too much either. The ones I've seen that have broken have also been repaired by adding a strip of rolled metal onto the top here. In fact, I believe there was a prototype machine that used this arrangement with the handle made as a separate flat bar, and why they stopped doing it that way, I don't know. But in the Soviet Union, it was very important for a man to be able to repair things in his own home. So things like this handle, if it broke. If he couldn't, it was grounds for mockery. And they had a special term for that, rukazhop, which means literally ass hands. You can see that the spray gun works very well. I'm impressed. You could easily paint a car with this and do a neat job. And you might be asking yourself, why would anyone want to spray paint with a vacuum cleaner? But in the society that this vacuum cleaner originates from, in the Soviet Union, you couldn't buy disposable cans of spray paint. So doing it this way was an economical solution. And this spraying attachment was also used by people to whitewash their apartments and moth-proof their clothes and mist their plants. So it was versatile. And against that background, you can see that it's a lot more useful than many of the features that modern vacuum cleaners have, like dust particle counters and remote control power switches. Now, in the Soviet Union, there were many ways of making the product versatile. And there were other models of vacuum cleaner that came in a hard cardboard cylinder with a shoulder strap, so you could carry it around and clean your neighbor's apartments. And others had a cushion that you could put on the top to make a stool. Now, this doesn't have either of those, but it does have a strong box with this insert where all of the tools are neatly labeled and explained. So there are brushes for different floors, for hard floors and for carpets, for cleaning clothes, and a crevice tool. And these are all made out of aluminium and wood, so they're very tough. And the flexible hose is made from rubber with a cloth coating. And the interesting thing about this is that if it perishes, you don't need to replace the end fittings. They're just glued on, and you can, with a bit of difficulty, pull them off, cut a new length of the rubber hose, and glue the end fittings back into place without needing to buy new ones. This hose is actually done very well. It's not showing any signs of perishing after 57 years. These fittings are also a very good design because they don't have any small lugs that can break off. There's a groove which is gripped by a spring clip in the vacuum cleaner body, so it's very rugged. It also comes with a very detailed manual. This is one for a slightly later model in the same series, and it explains the differences between the models, and it notes that they use the same motor and turbine unit in all three models for repairability. It also shows a cross-sectional diagram, explains how to use the tools, and it says here how long you should use each of the tools for without pausing. So 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 45 minutes, so you don't risk overheating the motor. So you're helping the owner to understand and take care of the product. Here it says how to replace the carbon brushes and that you should check them for the first time after 300 hours of use. And at the very back, there are two vouchers. Here's one for repairing the vacuum cleaner and another one for servicing it. So lubricating the bearings and checking and replacing the carbon brushes. And you can see it's obviously not needed repair because the voucher's still here, but it has been serviced. So here we can see that this is a very versatile design, well thought out, extremely balanced, with few weak points, and well matched to the society that it was designed for. And this is why the Vortex has become an icon of the Soviet Union.